My son-in-law punched me in the face. My own daughter dragged me out by my hair. All because I said no to giving them $3 million. I sat on the curb, bleeding, shivering, and wondering when my child became someone I no longer recognize. But what they didn't know was that I had already prepared for this moment. And 1 hour later, everything began to fall apart for them. I moved in with my daughter, April, the week after I turned 71. Not because I couldn't live on my own, but because she said she missed me, said she wanted me closer. Her husband, Russell, even agreed. At the time, I thought it was love. I didn't realize it was strategy. Their house sat on a quiet street outside Des Moines, with a wide porch and a white swing that never got used. April had decorated the guest room in lilac and ivory, my favorite colors. There were new sheets on the bed and a framed photo of us from her high school graduation. I remember standing there, suitcase still in hand, and thinking, maybe this will heal the distance between us. Yeah. It wasn't like I had nowhere else to go. I had a small apartment 2 towns over. I worked part-time at the public library, organizing historical archives and leading genealogy workshops. That work meant something to me. So did the quiet of my own home, my little kitchen, my ceramic owl salt shakers. But April said she missed our dinners. Said she wanted her kids to hear my stories. I believed her. The first week went well. She made me tea each night. Russell asked about my old job. The grandkids sat at my feet while I told them how our ancestors came over from Wales. I felt almost foolish for having doubted her. Then, gradually, small things changed. April started bringing up bills more often. Her voice was light, but the words were weighted. She talked about refinancing, about college savings, about how tight things had gotten. Russell mentioned an opportunity through one of his clients, some real estate fund, high return, low risk. He said it casually over dinner one night. I nodded politely, but something in my chest tightened. A few days later, April came into my room holding a folder. Inside were bank forms, a notarization page, and a printout of my investment account. She sat beside me on the bed. Her tone was careful. She said they just needed a short-term transfer, that they'd return it within 6 months, that it would help secure their future. I asked her how she got access to my account information. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. She said she'd always known my passwords, that she needed to check in on me sometimes. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan. Something had cracked open. I thought about my late husband, how we'd saved for years, bit by bit. I thought about the time I loaned April $2,000 to fix her transmission and how she never paid it back. I realized I had moved into a house where love came with conditions. By the end of that second week, I stopped leaving my bedroom door unlocked. Looking back, I wonder if any of you have felt that shift too. When a hug becomes a transaction, when kindness turns into currency. If you've ever trusted someone so much that you moved into their home only to feel the walls close in, then you know what I mean. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because what happened next would split everything wide open. By the start of the 3rd week, things shifted from subtle to obvious. I noticed it first with the grocery receipts. I always offered to pay for what I used. But one afternoon, April left a receipt on the counter, items circled in red, with a sticky note. Your share. Thanks. No greeting, no smiley face, just a number. Later, she handed me a printed breakdown of the monthly utilities, highlighted and organized into columns. Fairness keeps things clear, she said. That's how families stay strong. They didn't want a mother, they wanted a tenant. A few days later, I found Russell in the kitchen, flipping through a small black notebook. He closed it too fast when I entered. Later that night, I checked the drawer where I kept my personal folder. It was slightly out of place. Some documents had been moved. Something was unfolding behind my back. The next morning, April casually brought up estate planning. She asked if I'd considered simplifying my accounts, suggesting joint accounts for emergencies. She said it wasn't about money. It was about clarity, about peace of mind. Russell added that he could help with the paperwork. He had templates. I looked down at my cereal. The milk had gone warm. That afternoon, I called my financial advisor from my car. I told him to set alerts on all transfers, block any changes, and flag activity from unknown IPs. He asked if everything was okay. I said it was just a precaution. By the end of that week, April handed me a packet of documents, a sample transfer of authority, she said, just to get the ball rolling. Her tone was casual, but her eyes stayed fixed on mine. I didn't open it. 2 days later, Russell brought it up again. This time, while we were alone, he said April was just trying to help, that I was lucky to have a daughter who cared so much. Then he added with a smile too smooth, "Money only creates drama when people get secretive." I walked back inside and locked my bedroom door. That night, I reviewed every account I had. I changed passwords. I wrote down names of people I trusted. I scanned and saved backup copies to a flash drive I hid inside the lining of my suitcase. I wasn't afraid yet, but I had begun to prepare. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The third week blurred into the fourth, and with it came an eerie shift. It was in the way Russell's footsteps grew louder, in how April stopped knocking before entering my room. Small isolations, built slowly, then all at once. It began the morning I found my medicine organizer in the wrong drawer. The Tuesday slot was empty, even though I hadn't taken anything yet. I tossed the pills and started a new set from my travel stash. I began carrying my essentials in a zipped pouch that never left my side. One afternoon, I overheard Russell in the backyard talking too loudly into his phone. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard him mention equity, consolidation, and legal guardianship. Later, April asked if I would mind signing a few forms for her refinance. I asked why my name was listed as a co-owner of their secondary mortgage. She paused. "It must have been a clerical error," she said. I knew then I had underestimated how far they were willing to go. That night, I pulled out the manila envelope I kept hidden. Inside were old records, notarized copies of my trust, a full list of my assets. Everything had been kept separate since my husband passed. Russell and April didn't know that. They assumed I had nothing but the condo and a retirement account. But I still had access to a diversified portfolio, some of it offshore. I wasn't dependent. The next day, I visited the bank quietly. I asked for a full review of recent access attempts. There had been 2 failed login attempts from an IP address tied to Russell's business. I asked the manager to set the highest security level: biometric access, in-person-only changes, and voice-verified transactions. I returned home before sunset. Dinner was already on the table. Russell asked how my day had been. "I went to the park," I said. He nodded, satisfied. That night, I barely slept, not from fear, but from a growing sense that something inevitable was about to crack. And it did. 3 days later, I woke to find my room ransacked. My suitcase was unzipped, my drawers pulled open, even the lining of my coat was torn. My flash drive was gone. I stood silently in the doorway, then walked downstairs. April was in the kitchen. She didn't look up. Russell was by the fridge, arms crossed. I asked if anyone had been in my room. April said maybe one of the kids went in looking for scissors. Russell said maybe I had misplaced something. They said it too quickly. I went back upstairs, closed the door, and picked up the burner phone I kept hidden. I dialed my lawyer's office and gave his assistant the code word. He transferred me immediately. Within minutes, he confirmed he could lock down everything. I asked him to trigger the failsafe in my trust, to notify my offshore custodian that fraud had been attempted, and to make a preemptive report to Adult Protective Services. Then I packed a small overnight bag. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I simply acted. That evening, as I came downstairs, Russell was standing by the fireplace, holding my flash drive. He looked smug. I told them I was going out for a walk. They didn't stop me. At the corner of the block, I got into a black sedan my attorney had sent. We drove to a safe house I had arranged years ago. The next day, I froze all joint assets, placed a fraud alert, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. The silence in the safe house was different. It didn't echo. It wrapped around me like a warm coat. For the first time in weeks, I could hear my own breath again. Over the next 3 days, I stayed in that quiet little house in Ames. I thought about how it got this far, how two people I had once held as newborns could turn so calculating. On the fourth morning, I received an email from the bank. There had been an attempted login using outdated credentials. Then another from my lawyer. All assets had been moved. The new structure was untouchable, irrevocable. That same afternoon, I requested a call with the lead investigator at Adult Protective Services. I gave them everything. Every incident, every document, every photo. I wasn't pressing charges, not yet. But I wanted a record. The officer was patient and precise. She didn't offer false comfort, but she did say something I hadn't heard in a long time. She said I had done the right thing. Later that evening, I drove to my friend Patrice's home. She greeted me with open arms, no questions, just a hot casserole and a clean guest room. While I was there, I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of it all. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. They had tried to erase my autonomy, to replace my legacy with their convenience. But they failed. And that truth held me steady when the letter came. It was from a law firm representing Russell and April. They expressed concern over my sudden disappearance and requested a meeting to discuss a revised estate structure, claiming I might be under undue influence. I handed it to my lawyer. He smiled, highlighted every loaded phrase, and drafted a firm but polite reply. He included proof of my legal capacity, recent cognitive evaluations, and the timeline of events I had documented. Then he copied Adult Protective Services. The next day, a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit contacted me. The bank had flagged the earlier login attempts as part of a wider pattern of elder exploitation they were investigating. Russell's name had come up before. April's too. I sat across from him 2 days later and told him everything, not just the logistics, but the emotional sabotage. The detective nodded and asked if I'd be willing to testify. I said yes. I changed the name of the charitable fund I had created with my late husband. Originally named after our anniversary, I now called it the Ella Lenena Trust, after my grandmother. I restructured it so a portion of its interest would be granted to women over 65 who had survived financial abuse within their own families. I didn't need revenge. I needed meaning. By the end of the month, I had officially relocated. Patrice helped me find a 2-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood. I unpacked slowly, placing photos of my husband on the shelves, and framing a print of the trust certificate with my grandmother's name at the top. I'd lost a family, yes, but I had also reclaimed something I didn't know I was missing, myself. 2 weeks passed. I kept to myself, living quietly in the condo. The days were still and healing. Then came the letter from the probate court. A petition filed by April and Russell, requesting a hearing to declare me unfit to manage my estate. They were invoking the Elder Concern Act, claiming I was mentally compromised and being isolated by outside parties for financial gain. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so cruel. Attached were signed affidavits from 2 of their friends, people I had met no more than once or twice, speaking of my confusion and forgetfulness. I met with my attorney. He had expected this. He laid out a plan. We would respond with my cognitive evaluations and sworn statements from my financial advisor, neighbors, and church committee members. But there was something else. The detective I'd met with reached out again. They had uncovered surveillance footage of 2 separate attempts by Russell to access my accounts using documents that had been flagged as altered. That evening, Patrice suggested I write a letter to the court myself. "Speak as a woman, not a client," she said. "Let the judge hear your voice." It took me a day to decide. Then I sat down and wrote. 4 pages, long-handed. Not just facts, but feelings. I wrote about raising April, about the moment I realized she had changed. I explained in simple terms that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was clarity, and it had come far too late. My attorney added it to our response. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Those weeks passed with a strange stillness. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a navy suit I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. Courtrooms are colder than they look. I sat beside my attorney. April and Russell were on the other side. April wouldn't look at me. Their attorney painted me as disconnected, volatile, prey to manipulation. Then came our turn. My attorney introduced the evaluations, the statements, the timeline. Then he placed the letter I wrote on the record. The judge read it silently. When she looked up, she said it was rare in her courtroom to see such clarity from someone accused of incapacity. She dismissed the petition without delay, calling it an abuse of process. We walked out without a word to them. Back home, I made tea and sat on the balcony. The sky was wide, pale gold. Later, I received an email from a small women's advocacy group. Someone at the court had passed along my letter. They asked if I would speak at an upcoming forum, not about the legal case, but about resilience, about reclaiming identity. I closed the laptop, not ready yet. But the thought stayed. Maybe healing didn't look like closure. Maybe it looked like this: a quiet place, a name restored, and a voice that had finally found its volume. The week after the hearing, something inside me shifted. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was something quieter, like standing in a house that has been emptied out. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like walking away from a battlefield alone. That night, I sat at my little table and opened the storage box I had carried from the old house. Inside were photos, journals, and the leather folder with all the old letters Russell had sent in college. I stared at one for a long time, then pulled out my own journal. I turned to a fresh page and wrote one line: "Jiang, I'm still here." 3 days later, I met with my lawyer. He brought up the LLNANA fund. The first round of grants could be released in 6 months. Applications were already coming in, women of all ages with stories of loss, survival, quiet reinvention. Then he asked if I wanted to remain anonymous. I thought about what it meant to be visible, to have your name attached to something others might one day cling to. I told him no. I wanted my name on it. That evening I took a walk. I sat in a park, letting the late light hit my face, and thought about April. Not with anger, just stillness. She had made her choice, and now I had made mine. This time, it wasn't reactive. It was about choosing what I wanted to become. Back home, I made tea, then opened a blank document on my laptop. For the first time in years, I started writing my story. Not as a case, not as an article, but as a life. A full, flawed, quiet life. Mine. It began with the line from my journal: "I am still here." And from there, the words came like water. 3 weeks after going public with my name on the LLNA fund, a letter arrived from a federal investigator. They were reopening the inquiry into Russell. Several suspicious financial transfers had been flagged in a broader investigation into elder exploitation, and 2 names kept recurring: Russell and April. I met with the investigator. He looked too young to hold such power, but his eyes were patient. I gave them what I had, the story behind the numbers. He told me they had subpoenaed the bank for voice recordings. In one, a man identified himself as my son-in-law using my full name and social security number. The voice wasn't mine. The permission had never been recorded. That night, I sat alone in the living room with every light off. I didn't cry, but I felt it. That low hum of reckoning. It didn't taste like vengeance. It tasted like gravity. 2 days later, Patras stopped by with a binder. The LLNANA Fund wanted to expand, more outreach, a partnership with a university program, and a speaker series, women over 60 sharing real stories. They had penciled me in. I didn't say yes or no. That night, I thought about what it meant to speak, not whisper. My story wasn't rare. That was the hardest part. It was common, silent, ordinary. That silence needed to break. So, I agreed. I stood up at the first small gathering 2 weeks later. A modest community space, folding chairs, no microphones. I told them the truth. I was 71. I had raised a daughter I loved. I had watched her walk away in 100 quiet choices. I told them about Russell and the bathroom floor and the silence that followed. But mostly, I told them about waking up. About the day I realized survival was not the end goal, that dignity mattered more than peace. There were no cheers, just silence and a few tears. But that silence felt different now. Not the silence of shame, but of recognition. Afterward, a woman named Eloise took my hand. She was 73. Her daughter had taken her home equity line and vanished. She hadn't told anyone until that night. As she spoke, her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I realized that this was the true legacy. Somewhere in that room, a woman had breathed a little easier because I had spoken first. By late summer, the Ella Lenina Fund had started to circle quietly through nonprofit spaces. I agreed to speak again, this time at a women's center. I spoke about what came after, about what it felt like to sit in your own home without waiting for footsteps, about learning to cook for one and not feel pity. Afterward, a woman with salt and pepper hair asked if she could walk me to my car. Her name was Judy, 71. Her daughter had taken over her finances, her son-in-law the paperwork, and suddenly she couldn't access her own checking account. She whispered that she had no one else to tell. I gave her the center's number. She held the paper like a lifeline. That night, I couldn't sleep. It was the weight of it all, the stories piling up like fallen leaves. 2 days later, my lawyer called. The federal investigation had moved forward. Charges were being finalized: identity theft, elder abuse, financial coercion. Russell's name was listed. So was April's. The part that caught me off guard was the press request. A journalist from a respected outlet wanted to feature the Ella Lenina Fund in a national story. They asked if I would go on record fully. I said I needed a day. I walked for hours. The world had changed so much, and I had spent years just trying to survive. But now, I was standing in it. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. So I agreed. The article came out a week later. My name, my face, a photo of me standing in front of the library. The headline was simple: "And she spoke up." There were no angry calls from April, no letters from Russell. Just silence, but not the kind that haunted. This silence felt earned. The following week, a young woman from a local university reached out. She wanted to intern with the fund. She said her grandmother was one of the first women to apply and had cried reading the acceptance letter. I told her yes, not just because we needed help, but because I saw something in her, a continuity, proof that what we were building wasn't about me. It was bigger. That afternoon, I realized something. I hadn't thought about Russell or April in hours. They had finally stopped living in my head. And that, more than any court decision, felt like the real beginning. The day the letter arrived, I had just come back from the hardware store. The envelope was from April. Inside, a single page. She said she'd seen the article, that Russell had told her they made mistakes, that he wanted to make peace. They would like to meet for dinner. Friday 7:00. I placed the letter down. I wasn't going. I wasn't angry anymore. By Friday afternoon, I had forgotten it completely. It wasn't until the sun began to fall that I remembered. 7:00. Then at 7:30, my phone rang. Unknown number. I picked up. A nurse from the emergency room. April had been admitted with chest pains. They had found my number listed as next of kin. She had asked for me, said she was alone. I sat on the edge of the bed. I thought of the woman who had dragged me by the hair, and then I thought of the little girl who once fell asleep on my chest, who cried when she lost her stuffed elephant. So I went. The room was quiet. She looked smaller than I remembered. She opened her eyes and said my name. I pulled a chair closer and sat. We sat in silence. Then she said she had read everything, that she hadn't realized how far she had gone, that Russell kept pushing. I listened. Then she asked if the Ella Lenina Fund was a message to her. I shook my head. It was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming breath. Her eyes welled up. She said she couldn't undo what she had done, but she wanted to start again. Not as mother and daughter, just two people who once shared something true. I stood up then, slow, measured. I told her I didn't hate her, but I also told her I didn't belong to her anymore, that my peace didn't depend on her remorse. And then I walked out. Outside, the hospital parking lot buzzed. I exhaled. I had just looked into the eyes of the woman who once broke me, and she no longer held any power. That night, I made soup. I lit a candle. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking once. The morning after the hospital, I brewed a stronger cup of coffee. The postman handed me an envelope from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Federal charges were being brought against Russell. There had been an anonymous tip to the IRS 3 months earlier. The audit had revealed enough for a broader investigation. The tip had come from April. She had turned him in quietly, before the dinner invitation, before the hospital. She had cracked open the very house she had helped build. I didn't know if it was guilt or fear. Maybe it didn't matter. I placed the letter down and looked at the stack of seed catalogs by the window. Spring was near. A federal officer showed up at my door. He said my testimony would help expedite the case. Russell had already been questioned. His tone had shifted the moment he realized April had cooperated. When the officer left, I walked around the house slowly, touching the old furniture, the parts they never stole. That night, I reached for the journal I had been keeping and flipped to a blank page. I began writing, not about them, but about me. About my spine, my silence, my pulse in the early hours. About the slow unfurling of dignity. I didn't need justice to look like sirens in handcuffs. I just needed them to know I had survived. When the phone rang later, I let it go to voicemail. It was April. Her voice was low. She said Russell had left, that federal agents had come, that he had packed a suitcase and slammed the door. She said she didn't know where he went. Then she said she was sorry again, but it didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like release. I didn't return the call. Instead, I stood outside and breathed in the air. Cold, but clean. For the first time in a long while, I was exactly where I wanted to be. In the quiet hum of a world still turning, I smiled. Not from triumph, but from peace earned. 3 days after I let April's call go to voicemail, a letter arrived from my attorney. Inside was a copy of a legal document I didn't remember signing. It transferred nearly $3 million from my brokerage account to a holding entity under Russell's name. The transfer hadn't completed because of an alert placed by the bank. My lawyer had cross-checked the records and discovered something else. April's name had been added to the trust, but only conditionally. It would activate on my official declaration of incapacity. The dates lined up with my fall. The bruise on my neck, the dizziness, the medication I never remembered taking. They had tried to incapacitate me. Quietly, slowly, legally. They had anticipated resistance, but not survival. And now that entire paper trail sat in a manila folder in the attorney's office, with a time-stamped log. I walked outside. The wind was sharp. I sat on the back steps. I thought about all the meals I had cooked for April when she was young. She never knew what I gave up. That was the point. Now the woman she had become had not only turned her back on me, she had waited for me to disappear. And Russell had planned it like a chess match, believing I would never notice the checkmate coming. He had underestimated the one thing that mattered. I had lived through worse. The chapter of my life that included them was coming to a close, not with a scream, but with a woman on her back porch holding her coffee tighter, her pulse steadier, and her dignity completely intact. Because survival isn't loud. It's quiet and powerful and absolute. It was a Thursday morning when I walked into the courthouse alone. No makeup, no jewelry, no rush. The annulment of the trust was approved in chambers. The frozen funds were returned. The invalid power of attorney was nullified. My name, my full, untarnished name, was reinstated as the sole authority on my life. It didn't come with applause, but something deep inside me exhaled. Outside, I sat on a bench. The sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. A woman passed by, older than me, with a small dog. We locked eyes just briefly. I gave her a soft nod, and for a split second, it felt like she knew. Not the whole story, just the weight of surviving something and still standing. When I got home, I walked to the old potting bench. My hands itched to be in the soil. That afternoon, I planted 3 trays of pansies, purple and white. Hardy little things. They come back even after the cold tries to wipe them out. A week later, Russell called. He left a voicemail. His voice was lower than usual. Said he was sorry. Said April wanted to talk. I deleted it. A few days after that, an envelope arrived. Inside, a photo of April, younger, holding her daughter, smiling. The edges were worn. I held it for a moment. I didn't cry, but I didn't throw it away either. I placed it in the drawer where I keep the things that matter, but no longer define me. I'm not angry anymore. Not exactly. There's a silence now, a different kind of quiet. Not absence, more like clarity. Like a room finally cleaned of echoes that no longer belong. And I found something in that silence. Peace. Not the kind that comes from justice, but the kind that comes from knowing I chose myself. I no longer live in reaction to what they did. I live in response to who I've become. If this story reminded you of someone who once tried to silence your worth, I hope you know it is never too late to take your voice back. Have you ever walked away from someone you loved to protect the part of you they kept trying to erase? Your story matters too. Share it below if you'd like, or just know you're not alone.